"You don't know who you're dealing with." He said it right to my face. He had no idea what was coming. I have sat on that bench for a very long time. I have looked into the eyes of thousands of people, good people, broken people, frightened people, dishonest people. I have heard every kind of story, every kind of excuse, every kind of lie dressed up to sound like the truth. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty. In all those years, nothing unnerves me anymore. But there are moments, rare ones, that stay with you. Not because they were loud, not because they were dramatic, but because they were revealing. Because right there in front of everyone, a person showed you exactly who they were. And once you see that clearly, you can never unsee it. This is one of those moments, and I want to share it with you today. If stories like this one mean something to you, the kind that remind you why truth matters, why dignity matters, why justice matters, please subscribe before we go any further. There are more stories coming, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Now, let me take you back to that morning. I remember walking into the courtroom the way I always do. Steady, quiet, focused. I don't rush. I never have. When you've spent enough years in a black robe, you learn that the courtroom speaks to you before a single word is said. The energy in the room tells you things. The way people sit, where they look, how tightly someone holds their pen. That morning I felt it before I even took my seat. There was a man standing at the defendant's podium. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Richard Holt. And the moment I walked in, he was already watching me. Not nervously, assessingly. The way someone watches a situation they believe they already control. I took my seat. I arranged my papers. I looked up, and I saw everything I needed to see in about 10 seconds. Richard Holt was well-dressed, expensive suit, the kind that fits too perfectly to be off the rack, a watch that caught the light just enough to announce itself without screaming. His posture was loose, comfortable, the way people stand when they have never once been told to sit down and mean it. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't humble. He wasn't even particularly interested. He was patient in the way that powerful people are patient, not because they respect the process, but because they believe the process is simply something to be endured before they get what they want. I had seen that posture before, many times. I will tell you right now, it is always the most dangerous kind of person to have in a courtroom. Not the angry ones, not the desperate ones, the comfortable ones, the ones who believe the rules apply differently to them. Those are the ones you have to watch very carefully. The case itself, at its core, was not complicated. A woman, I'll call her Margaret, had come to court seeking compensation. She was in her early 60s. She had worked for a property management company that Richard Holt owned for 11 years. 11 years. She had managed tenant complaints, handled maintenance emergencies at midnight, kept his buildings running. She was the kind of employee who shows up early and leaves late and never asks for credit. Then, without warning, without documentation, without even a face-to-face conversation, she was let go by email on a Tuesday afternoon. And when she asked about the severance she had been promised, in writing, 2 years prior, she was told the document was, quote, informal and non-binding. She had come to my courtroom holding that piece of paper like it was her last lifeline, because for her, it was. She had a granddaughter, medical bills, a mortgage that didn't forgive the loss of a paycheck just because an employer decided a written promise was suddenly inconvenient. She stood at her podium quietly, hands folded, eyes a little red but dry. She had cried her tears before she got here. Now she just wanted someone to listen. I listened. Richard Holt spoke first, and from the very first sentence, I noticed something. He didn't look at Margaret once. Not once. In my experience, innocent people look at the person accusing them. They can't help it. They want to say, "Look at me, I didn't do this." But guilty people, they look away. They keep their eyes forward. They treat the other person like furniture. He reframed every question I asked him. He added details that weren't requested. He answered the question he preferred rather than the one I actually asked. When I asked him to be brief, he spoke longer. When I raised my hand to slow him down, he smiled, slightly, barely, but I caught it, that smile. Not rude, not openly defiant, just amused, like he thought this was a formality, like he was tolerating something mildly beneath him. I said nothing about it, not yet. I just let him talk. Because the longer someone like Richard Holt talks, the more they say. And the more they say, the more clearly you see the outline of what they're actually hiding. He started small. He claimed the severance letter was written informally during a difficult business quarter, that it was meant to be motivational, not contractual. He called it a morale document. He said Margaret had misunderstood its purpose. I asked him when he first became aware she was relying on it as a contract. He said he hadn't known until she filed this claim. I nodded, wrote something down. I asked when he had last spoken to Margaret directly, before the email termination. He said it had been a few weeks. I asked if there had been any communication between them in the 2 months before she was let go. He said no, very little. I nodded again. I didn't say anything else. Not yet. But inside, and I want to be honest with you here, inside I felt that familiar quiet, that calm that settles into you when you can see clearly where something is going, even though no one else in the room can see it yet. The trap wasn't something I built to be cruel. It was something he built himself, answer by answer. I was just holding the door open. He grew bolder as the minutes passed. That is always how it works with men like him. Silence from authority reads to them as weakness. When I didn't push back immediately, he took it as permission. His tone shifted. He became slightly more dismissive when Margaret tried to respond, cutting just barely into her pauses. Not loud enough to be rude, but loud enough to be deliberate. At one point he mentioned, casually, almost parenthetically, that he had relationships with people across the city. He didn't name names. He never does, that type. They prefer implication. The hint is always more powerful than the statement because it lets the other person fill in the blanks with whatever they fear most. He spoke about how long, drawn-out legal disputes can damage reputations. He spoke about how uncomfortable things could become. He kept his voice even, his expression neutral. I looked at Margaret when he said it. Her hands tightened in her lap, just slightly. She had heard this before. I could see it. This wasn't the first time he had reminded her of his reach. This was a language she had learned to be afraid of somewhere along the way. That made me very still, not angry, not reactive, still, because the moment anger enters a courtroom, clarity leaves, and I needed every bit of my clarity for what was about to happen. I let a pause fall over the room. Then I said quietly, "Mr. Holt, let's talk about the phone records." The room shifted. It wasn't loud. Nobody gasped. But something changed in the air immediately, the way temperature changes just before a storm. Richard Holt looked at me. For the first time, the ease in his face cracked, just slightly. A small confusion crossed his eyes, barely a flicker. He recovered quickly. He was practiced at that. "Phone records," he said, still calm, but his weight shifted at the podium. I told him simply the court had received documentation. Telephone records between his personal cell number and Margaret's, multiple calls across a period of 6 weeks. During the exact same window, he had just told me there had been very little communication. He opened his mouth. I continued. The calls were not casual. The last one lasted 22 minutes. It was placed at 9:30 on a Tuesday evening, 3 days before she received the termination email. His jaw tightened. I did not raise my voice. I did not look away. I simply held the page and waited. Then I told him about the voicemail. I described it in detail, not to humiliate him, but because detail matters in a courtroom. Detail is where truth lives. The message had been left on Margaret's personal phone 4 weeks before her termination. The tone was controlled but pointed. It referenced consequences if she continued to consult with anyone about her employment terms. It reminded her, calmly and specifically, that he had taken care of her very well over the years. taken care of her very well. Those exact words. I looked up from the page. I said, "In your experience, Mr. Holt, does a person send a voicemail like that to someone they haven't spoken to in weeks?" He did not answer. For the first time, Richard Holt did not answer immediately. He stood there, and I watched something happen to him that I have watched happen to many people in that room. The moment when the story they have been carrying collides with the world as it actually is, and the two things simply will not fit together anymore. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, and then he did what I knew he would do. He doubled down. People who have never been challenged don't know how to retreat gracefully. They only know one gear, forward. So when the ground gives way beneath them, they push harder. They believe if they apply enough force, the facts will move. Richard Holt straightened his back and began to speak faster now. He said the records were being misrepresented. He said the context was being ignored. He said he had built something from nothing and was being treated like a criminal in a room full of cameras. And then, leaning forward, voice dropping into that calm, measured register that people use when they want a warning to land without sounding like a warning, he said it. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." The courtroom went completely still. I mean that literally. The air stopped. The shuffling stopped. The quiet background hum of the room just paused. I looked at him. He was not shouting. He was not out of control. That was the most important thing to understand. This was not a man losing his temper. This was a man making a decision. He believed those words would restore what the last 10 minutes had taken from him. He believed authority would flinch, that I would recalibrate, that I would decide quietly that this particular case was more trouble than it was worth. He had used those 7 words before, and they had worked before. I could tell. I sat very still, and I said nothing. Not because I was thinking about what to say, but because silence, used correctly, is the most powerful thing in a courtroom. It forces the other person to sit inside what they have just said, to hear it replay, to begin, for the first time, to wonder. I let him wonder. Then I looked at him calmly, and I said, "Mr. Holt, in this room, threatening the court isn't a strategy. It's a confession." I want to tell you what happened to his face in that moment, because I have thought about it many times since. It wasn't rage. It wasn't defiance. It was something quieter and far more significant. It was the specific expression of a person who has just realized, truly realized, that the rules they built their life around do not apply here. The color left his face slowly, not all at once. His mouth opened and then closed. He looked down at the podium for a fraction of a second, just long enough to search for something to hold on to, and then back up at me. He found nothing. The room was absolutely silent. And I want to tell you about Margaret in that moment, because she matters most in this story, and it would be wrong to leave her out. She was sitting at her table with her hands still folded in her lap. And when I said those words, she closed her eyes, just for a second. A single breath in, then out. And when she opened them again, they were wet, not from sadness. I have watched people cry in courtrooms for decades. I know the difference between tears of grief and tears of relief. Those were relief, the kind that comes when someone has been waiting, silently, patiently, without much hope, for someone in authority to simply see what has been done to them. She had waited a long time. I gave my ruling, clearly, completely, without hesitation. I awarded Margaret the full amount she was owed, the severance promised in writing, 2 years of documented promises, compensation for the manner in which she was dismissed. I noted for the record that the communication patterns documented in this case told a very clear story about intent, about awareness, and about pressure applied to prevent someone from exercising their legal rights. Richard Holt tried to speak. I said, "No," I told him. "You've spoken enough." His attorney touched his arm. He shook it off, but he stayed quiet. I looked at him one final time before I concluded. I said, "This court is not afraid of you, But you should be afraid of what you showed us today. I did not say it with cruelty. I said it with sorrow, because here is the truth, and this is the part I want you to sit with for a moment. I was not celebrating. I was not satisfied in the way that people might expect. When a ruling goes the right way, there is no joy in it for me. There is only the quiet, heavy weight of knowing that someone had to come this far, had to be this desperate, had to stand in a room full of strangers and fight this hard just to receive what they were always owed. That weight never gets lighter. I'm glad it doesn't. The courtroom cleared slowly that day. I stayed at the bench a little longer than usual. I do that sometimes. I sit in the quiet after everyone leaves and I think. I thought about Margaret, about 11 years of early mornings and late nights, about a piece of paper she had folded and unfolded so many times the creases had turned soft, about a granddaughter she was trying to take care of, about the way she had stood at that podium, not angry, not bitter, just present, asking for what was hers. I thought about how many Margarets there are in this world, how many people carry a folded piece of paper that someone powerful decided to call informal the moment honoring it became inconvenient. I thought about Richard Holt walking out of that building, because I did not hate him. I want to be clear about that. I have never hated anyone I ruled against. Not once. Hatred has no place in a courtroom, and it has no place in a just life. But I felt something for him that day that was perhaps more uncomfortable than hatred. I felt pity. Not condescending pity, not the kind that diminishes, the genuine kind, the kind that comes from understanding. Because Richard Holt had spent his entire life learning that confidence was the same thing as character, that power was the same thing as being right, that if you spoke with enough certainty, enough authority, enough implied consequence, the world would rearrange itself around you. And for a long time it had. No one had stopped him. No one had said, no, this is not how it works. The people around him had learned to bend. His employees had learned to be quiet. The rules had learned to look the other way, until they didn't. That is always how it ends. Not with a crash, not with a confrontation, with a quiet room, a simple document, and someone who refuses to be moved. A few weeks after that case, Margaret sent a short letter to the courthouse. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't ask for recognition. She just wrote to say that she had been able to take her granddaughter to see the doctor, that she had made her mortgage payment, that she had slept better in the last 2 weeks than she had in the last 2 years. She wrote one line that I have thought about more than anything else she said. She wrote, "I just needed someone to believe me." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I folded the letter and kept it. Not as a reminder of a case I won. There are no cases I win. The court doesn't win. The court serves. I kept it as a reminder of why any of this matters. Why I walk into that courtroom every morning with the same care I had on the very first day. Why I never let myself stop being moved by what is at stake for the people who stand in front of me. Why I refuse to let the weight of years make me callous. Because every case is someone's whole world. Every document is someone's survival. Every quiet person standing at that podium, hands folded, eyes red but dry, is fighting for something real, and they deserve someone who will listen, someone who will not be threatened, someone who will not be bought, bent, or intimidated. That is what a courtroom is supposed to be. I want to leave you with this today. Arrogance always believes it is protected by the very thing that is destroying it. Richard Holt believed his confidence would shield him. Instead, it exposed him. He believed his words would intimidate. Instead, they became evidence. He believed his power made him untouchable. Instead, it made him legible, perfectly, completely legible, to a court that had seen every version of him 1,000 times before. True authority does not shout. It does not need to. It simply waits. It listens. It allows people to reveal themselves fully, and then, quietly, it acts. That is justice. Not perfect, not always fast, not without heartbreak along the way, but real and sturdy and worth every morning I walk through those courtroom doors. I believe in it, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days. If this story moved you, if you believe dignity matters, if you believe a person's word should mean something, if you believe no one should be too powerful to be held accountable, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, I'd be honored to have you subscribe. There are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about people like Margaret, quiet, strong, and worth fighting for. Until next time, take care of each other.